Good afternoon, and welcome to the Johns Hopkins 30-minute COVID-19 briefing, where we provide live insights from the experts who lead our work at the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. For the next half hour, we'll focus on what you need to know right now about the COVID-19 pandemic and public health responses. We'll be offering these 30-minute briefings regularly on Fridays at 12 p.m. I'm Dr. Lainie Rutkow, a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I'm part of the leadership team for the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. We'll be providing answers in real time today, so please submit your questions in the box at the bottom of your screen. Today, I'm joined by two guests. First, Dr. Brian Garibaldi, who's the director of the Johns Hopkins Biocontainment Unit and an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Brian will give an update about the treatment of COVID-19 patients. Then we'll hear from Dr. Bill Moss. Bill is the executive director of the Johns Hopkins International Vaccine Access Center and a professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Bill will give an update about COVID-19 vaccines. I'm going to first turn to each of our speakers for a brief overview. Brian, first to you. It seems like we're moving towards the end of the current Delta surge. Based on what you're seeing in the hospital, is there reason for optimism as we move through the rest of this fall?
Well, I think I'd be careful with saying we're nearing the end of it. We're still close to 100,000 new infections per day, but certainly things in Maryland seem to have plateaued in terms of the number of patients who are hospitalized right now. We still continue to see the majority of the patients in the hospital are those who are unvaccinated. So this still continues to be an epidemic right now of the unvaccinated. So I'd encourage everyone to please do your part in talking to people who aren't vaccinated. Get vaccinated yourselves if you're not vaccinated. I think what we're concerned about now and what you're starting to hear a little bit more about in the media is, what to expect during the fall as we move into the winter during flu season. Last year we were very worried about the combination of flu and COVID putting a big strain on our health systems. We did not see that last year, in large part because of all the mitigation strategies we had in place for COVID really prevented the spread of the flu. We really saw almost no flu last year. And it remains to be seen how much flu we're going to see this year and whether or not the fact that most of us didn't get the flu last year is going to impact how many people are likely to get the flu this year, even if they get vaccinated. So I think there's a little bit of a concern about that. Obviously, we're happy to see that cases are finally starting to come down across the United States, but we're not out of the woods yet. There have been some, I think, encouraging developments on the COVID front in terms of therapeutics. So there was data that came out in the last week from a large study looking at the real-world effectiveness of remdesivir, which essentially recapitulated what we had seen in the large NIH study that led to its approval as a treatment for hospitalized patients with COVID-19. It reduces the time it takes to get better, and there was a signal in this larger study that it actually might even improve mortality for patients who are less ill when they get treated. So that's been encouraging news for something that we've been using now for quite some time. But I think the excitement that everyone's really been talking about is Merck and Ridgeback announced the results of their outpatient study for molnupiravir. This is an oral antiviral agent, and they had about 800 people who were in their study, and they reported a 50% reduction in the likelihood of hospitalization if patients were treated as outpatients before they became severely ill. We haven't seen the data yet. This is still just a press release, but they're going to be applying for an emergency use authorization. And so I think that provides some hope that in the future, we may have some oral treatments that we can use to try to prevent people from getting sick and hospitalized.
Thanks so much, Brian. Before I turn to Bill, I want to remind those who are watching, please submit questions in the box at the bottom of your screen. Our experts are anxious to answer them, and we will move to Q&A shortly. Bill, the news this week suggests that we're even closer to a vaccine for those in the 5 to 12 age group. As the parent of a child in that age group, you can imagine I am both excited and relieved, and I know I am. There are so many other parents who feel the same way. So it brings this sense of relief, but we also know that the global vaccine situation remains bleak. So how do we reconcile these disparate moments?
Yes, Lainie, a lot happening still in the vaccine front, and you're right. These issues of global vaccine inequities remain very vexing and problematic. I want to start off, Lainie. I've been reading Vaccine Nation, America's Changing Relationship with Immunization, that was written by Elena Conness, who was a professor at Emory University when she wrote this book back in 2015. She's now at the University of California, Berkeley. And so this is back in 2015, largely around childhood immunizations in this country. But I want a quote from her in the introduction that has just been so striking to me. She wrote, "If the stories herein reveal just one thing, it is that we have never vaccinated for strictly medical reasons. Vaccination was and is thoroughly infused with our politics, social values, and our cultural norms. By acknowledging and understanding the divergent reasons why we've vaccinated in the past, however, we just may ensure the continued success of vaccination in the future." So this idea that vaccination is thoroughly infused with our politics, social values, and cultural norms couldn't be more true as we're facing many of these challenges with vaccine inequities, both here in the United States and certainly globally. We're seeing an uptick, Lainie, in vaccination rates in the United States. We're now up to about 850,000 new doses or doses administered each day on average. But what's driving that now are booster doses, and there have been reports, and based on data from the CDC, that we're now delivering more booster doses in the United States than first doses. Just to give you a feel for that, about 400,000 booster doses compared to about 300,000 first doses. So we're vaccinating the same people now. There's a population in the United States that wants to be vaccinated and a population that doesn't. And we're facing this challenge of we're now giving more doses to those who've been fully vaccinated, with 2 doses. An additional dose. And that's reflected when we look at the coverage in the United States. So the proportion of people fully vaccinated in the United States is about 56%. When you look at just those 12 and older who are eligible for vaccination, it's of 2/3. So that leaves 1/3 of the population that's not fully vaccinated. There's a lot of heterogeneity across counties and states, across age groups, across race and ethnicity, across political affiliation. So our progress really in getting that high coverage that we need to really put this pandemic behind us has been problematic, and it's really stalled. We've seen both carrots and sticks, incentives and mandates. Just yesterday, President Biden again called on private companies to mandate coronavirus vaccines for employees. We've seen that this is having an impact, but it also has its downside. We hear about in some industries and some sectors, workers leaving because of these mandates. But I think that will help us drive vaccination coverage up. We have to remember that there's a long history of required or compulsory vaccination here in the United States. We've had vaccine mandates set by states and local jurisdictions for school children, for healthcare workers, and the Supreme Court has twice upheld the states' rights to compulsory vaccination, first back in 1905 and then in 1922. Now, a lot of big news around booster doses authorized by the FDA and recommended by the CDC for individuals who receive 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine to get an additional booster dose of a Pfizer vaccine. Complex recommendations from the CDC, 2 groups that should receive a booster dose: those older than 65 years of age and those 50 to 49 years of age who have an underlying medical condition that places them at high risk. 2 groups that may receive a booster dose based on a personal assessment of risk and benefits: those 18 to 49 with an underlying medical condition, and those who are at high risk of exposure through their occupation or institutional setting where they reside. In the United States here, more than 6 million booster doses have been administered, but there are still a number of questions outstanding around booster doses, their duration of protection. Should people who've received the Moderna or Johnson & Johnson vaccine receive booster doses? What about mixing vaccine types, what's called heterologous, or this mix and match booster dose strategy? So fortunately, next week, the advisory committee to the FDA, what's called the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, will be meeting on October 14th and October 15th. On October 14th, they'll be discussing the need for, or actually regulation of, booster doses for Moderna. On the 15th, they'll be discussing the same issue, booster doses for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as well as looking at some data from the NIH on this mix and match strategy that the NIH has been studying. So we're going to hear more. We'll have a lot more to talk about next Friday after this meeting of the advisory committee to the FDA. Now, you mentioned, Lainie, movement on vaccine availability for children 5 to 11 years of age. Again, with the Pfizer vaccine, Moderna and Johnson & Johnson are a few months behind on this. But what we know is that on September 20th, Pfizer issued a press release that showed both safety and immunogenicity of their vaccine at a smaller dose in children 5 to 11 years of age. So they don't have trial data on vaccine efficacy. It's comparing levels of neutralizing antibodies in this age group with this smaller dose with individuals 16 to 25 years of age who received the full dose. And just a reminder that that smaller dose is 1/3 the size. The full dose is 30 micrograms, and the dose that was studied or selected for 5 to 11-year-olds, 10 micrograms. Now on September 28th, Pfizer submitted some preliminary data to the FDA, and just yesterday they submitted their formal application to the FDA, and very soon after that, the FDA scheduled another meeting of their independent advisory committee on October 26th. To discuss this formal application in children 5 to 11 years of age. So it's going to take a little bit after that. I know we've been talking about end of October. It's possible if there are no real hiccups or questions, but it could take a couple more weeks and take us into mid to late November even to get authorization from the FDA. I just want to point out that vaccine coverage today in children 12 to 15 years of age is only 45%. And so it's going to be interesting to see. I know there are a lot of parents like yourself, Lainie, who are very interested in a vaccine for their children 5 to 11 years of age, but we're going to have to see what the national coverage is. I'm not sure it's even going to be, what we're seeing in the 12 to 15-year-old age group. Maybe it's not even going to reach half of the children. Some interesting recommendations from that, or strategies that some other countries are taking, including Britain and Sweden and Denmark, is that they're recommending only a single dose of a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine for children. What they're considering for children 12 and older. And what they're trying to do here, Lainie, is really balance this trade-off between protection and side effects. And there has been this concern of a rare adverse event, myocarditis or pericarditis, particularly in younger males, adolescent, young adult males. And so some countries have made this decision to go with a single dose. We'll have to see what happens here in the United States. Now, the problem of global inequities that's really raised in part by these issues of boosters and vaccinating children in high-income countries continues to be, as I said earlier, a really vexing problem. Right now, only or 98% of people who reside in low-income countries have not been vaccinated. The biggest problem is on the continent of Africa, where just over 17% of the people have received at least a single dose, not even fully vaccinated. Only about 4% of people in Africa have been fully vaccinated. And so what we're seeing, continued statements just yesterday by the UN Secretary General criticizing these global inequities in COVID-19 vaccine distribution between rich and poor countries. Our own Global Health Now reported this morning that a report from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and Stat News on the problems that COVAX has faced. Remember, COVAX is that attempt to really organize and mobilize vaccines for low-income countries, and they just haven't been able to deliver. And so doses have arrived late, doses have been delivered close to their expiration date, and then they ran into this huge problem of relying on the Serum Institute of India to provide a large number of their doses, and that pipeline got shut off when Indian banned export of vaccines as they face their own national crisis. So this remains a very big problem, and we still don't have the solutions for how we're going to address these inequities, both here in the United States and globally.
Thanks so much, Bill. I want to raise two reminders for our audience. The first one picks up on something that Brian mentioned in his opening remarks, which was the exciting news that came out of Merck this week about their COVID therapeutic. Earlier this week, on Monday, the dean of the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins had a conversation with Merck CEO Robert Davis. We're going to provide a link to that during this briefing, and that topic about Merck's exciting COVID news did come up. I also want to remind those who are watching that the Coronavirus Resource Center does offer a weekly newsletter called The Week in COVID-19. And it's a great way to get the latest news about the virus, variants, and critical trends to your inbox every Monday from our experts. And now I'm going to turn to the questions. So Bill, no surprise, as usual, a lot of vaccine-related questions for you. First is, for those who are now getting the Pfizer booster, is that a different formulation than the original two-dose series?
Thanks, Lainie. The answer is that is the same vaccine. It's the same formulation, and it's the same dose. There is some discussion around a Moderna booster dose that would be a lower dose, but the Moderna vaccine has a higher dose to start with. That's 100 micrograms. But the answer is the Pfizer booster dose, same formulation, same dose.
Thanks, Bill. And what are your thoughts as we head into flu season, or at least flu vaccine season, about getting flu and COVID vaccines? Do it the same day, space them out?
Yeah, so first of all, it's very important that people be vaccinated against COVID-19, against SARS coronavirus 2 and influenza. As Brian said, we're unsure what this influenza season is going to look like, but it could be bad because very few of us were exposed to influenza viruses last season. But the bottom line is that people can get those at the same time, on the same day. So that can make it more convenient to be vaccinated at the same time. There's no evidence that they interfere with one another.
Thanks, Bill. Brian, question for you. What advice do you have when you're speaking to patients who are anxious to get back out there, go to sporting events outside, go to theater or other events inside? How can they do that and be safe?
Well, I think it starts with, taking into consideration your own unique health characteristics. By and large, these vaccines are very effective. But I think the advice that I give particular patients depends on what their underlying health status is. Particularly if they're on medications that might reduce the likelihood that the vaccine was effective in them. So those are patients who are on active treatment with chemotherapy agents or immunosuppressive agents, solid organ transplant patients. But for the vast majority of people, if you've been vaccinated, you can begin to think about attending some of these events. I do personally think you should wear a mask indoors right now. There's still a lot of community transmission of SARS-CoV-2, and I think you're safest if you wear a mask indoors. I think outdoors, it really depends on the activity, how many people are going to be there, how close you're going to be to people, and what you're doing. You know, if you're at a Ravens game and there are lots of people that you don't know around you yelling and shouting, you know, I probably would have my mask on in that particular environment. But, you know, it might be different depending on what the environment is and how much you can maintain that distance from other people. But I think you can start engaging in these activities, but, you know, indoors, you should absolutely be wearing a mask. And I think for other activities, you need to take into account your own personal situation and your tolerance for risk, because vaccines are really, really effective, but they're not perfect, right? You know, the vaccines prevent you from developing disease if you come in contact with the virus, but you still may come in contact with the virus depending on what your activities are.
Thanks, Brian. Bill, some questions coming in about Novavax. Can you talk through generally where are we with it? When are we likely, if ever, to see an authorization?
Yeah, so the Novavax vaccine, it's a very different type of vaccine than either the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer or Moderna or the adenovirus vectored vaccines. It's more traditional in one sense, is that it's a protein-based vaccine. So instead of having our own cells produce the spike protein that our immune system responds to, it's injecting a version of the spike protein itself. What Novavax does is able to kind of attach those spike proteins to these little microparticles, so that a lot of them are being presented to our immune system. And we've seen from some of the early evidence, the data that Novavax has presented, that it looks to be, have really high protective clinical efficacy against disease. And so what's happened, there are a couple things. There have been some manufacturing issues that Novavax has faced that have kind of delayed, I'll say, the part of the approval process and ability to move forward. I think another interesting question is whether the FDA would even be willing to consider an emergency use authorization for the Novavax vaccine, or whether they'll have to seek a full approval right away. And the reason I say that is that emergency use authorizations are issued obviously in an emergency, but when there are no alternatives available. And so the question is, now that we have 3 vaccines that we're using and one that has received full approval, the Pfizer vaccine for those older than 16, do those conditions still exist? If the FDA is not willing to consider an EUA for the Novavax vaccine, then that's going to even further prolong the process, because they'll have to present more data for a full approval. So the bottom line is we don't quite yet know yet. I think it's still a couple months away, but it's going to critically depend upon whether they're eligible for an emergency use authorization or have to apply for full approval.
Thanks, Bill. And one more question for you, although I'm going to start with Brian and then turn to you, Bill. So Brian, question for you is, are you seeing a lot of folks come in who have had extended spacing between getting the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, meaning that it's been more than 3 or 4 weeks between their doses?
Yeah, we've seen patients who have come in and for whatever reason didn't get their second dose at the appointed time. We don't have a lot of great data on how that really impacts the protective effects of the vaccine, but certainly if you've missed that second dose, you should come in and get it as soon as you can, because it's likely to, we do know that a single dose, particularly against the Delta variant, has much less efficacy at preventing symptomatic disease than if you were fully vaccinated with the 2 doses of Pfizer and Moderna.
Thanks, Brian. And Bill, the follow-up to that question is, from other countries that have had different spacing, have we learned anything yet? Are there studies available?
Yeah, so a couple points to raise around this. So there are other countries that have spaced out that second dose, and there are data that suggests that timing remains, protective. There aren't formal studies looking at different time points, as Brian said. So we don't have great kind of trial data on different timing schedules. We have this observational data from other countries or where people have spaced out the doses. I'll say, the decision to go with a 3-week or a 4-week spacing was driven in part because of the urgency of the pandemic and the need and the desire to try to get these vaccines through the clinical trials so that we could get authorizations for their use. So this is a fairly tight schedule, the 3 or 4 weeks, and it's quite possible that longer spacing between the doses might even result in better immune responses. But as Brian said, we don't have great data. But I would certainly encourage everyone, who didn't get their second dose to go ahead and get their second dose, even if it's much later than what the schedule dictates.
Thanks so much, Bill. And you are getting the last word today since we're coming up on 12:30. So I'd like to thank Brian Garibaldi and Bill Moss for joining me today. Give a big thank you to everyone who joined us, and especially to those who submitted questions for our experts to answer. This briefing will be archived and available on coronavirus.jhu.edu. As a reminder, we do offer these 30-minute briefings regularly on Fridays at 12 p.m. We'll be back next Friday, October 15th at noon. I look forward to seeing you next week. And until then, thanks and stay safe.